All right, great. Can everybody hear me? Allison had decided to mute me there. I think she's heard enough of me, so luckily we figured it out. But welcome everybody. My name is Jordan Moss. I'm the founder of Catalyst Housing Group. Pleased to be joining you today in conjunction with SB at Home and their Affordable Housing Month, hosting this panel on middle income housing. Affordably housing California's essential missing middle. We're joined today by Ben Metcalf and by Jennifer Ott. We're going to do some intros here shortly, and I'll apologize ahead of time for my voice. Most definitely under the weather. Some combination of receiving my second COVID vaccine and living with 3 small walking, talking Petri dishes. The combination of all of that has definitely led to what I'm struggling through today. But thanks for being here. Excited to see everybody, chat with everybody. We're going to do some intros. We're going to go into a panel discussion with Ben and Jennifer, and we definitely want to leave time for some audience Q&A. Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and take things from here and say hello to the group, let everybody know who you are, what you're up to?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Jordan, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Ott, and I'm the Assistant City Manager for the City of Hayward. And we are in the city actively working towards meeting our housing goals for the state and working to, we've approved incentives to housing production plan for the city and have over 200 acres of public land that we manage as a portfolio that we are actively working to build housing and affordable housing on. And so really excited to be talking about the middle income models that are out there. We've been working with Catalyst Housing Group. We have a project that has closed, and really excited to explore and pilot some new programs and see what we can do to really meet that moderate income and middle income tranche. That is really one that we struggle to try to meet in our RENA goals. So really excited to have some conversations about that. But thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks for being here. Ben, why don't we hand the mic to you?
Hey guys. Jordan, Jennifer, great to join you today. Thank you also to Silicon Valley at Home for hosting this fantastic series. My name is Ben Metcalf. I am Managing Director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. At least it's what keeps me busy most of the time. The Turner Center was founded about 5 years ago and was set up to really be a whole of housing organization. So looking at everything from lack of supply at the upper end to homelessness to land use, to try and think about how we can make some progress on housing affordability across the board. I've spent my whole career in housing. Most recently was in Sacramento running the Department of Housing and Community Development there. I've also spent some time at HUD staring very closely at federal housing policies, and have done a little bit of development in an earlier life for affordable housing here in the Bay Area.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you again for being here. Maybe just to level set for everybody, we'll talk a little bit about what we call the missing middle. There's a couple definitions of missing middle out there. Sometimes it has to do more so with the type of product you're developing. Generally, when we talk about the missing middle, we're talking about this situation that exists today where there's housing production at the very lower end, mostly through LIHTC financed affordable housing, capital A affordable housing, tax credit housing, other local, regional, federal, state level programs. And then the other end of the spectrum, which is really high-end market rate housing. But generally in the middle, when you think of our essential workforce, our nurses, teachers, first responders, our civil servants, there's a whole host of people who generally earn in excess of traditional capital A affordable housing income limits, yet not enough to live anywhere near where they work. The ripple effects of this are pretty severe. I think anybody who has been in the Bay Area for any period of time, and don't let maybe some of the traffic patterns during COVID fool you, but in more normalized times, we see people driving until they qualify. All of the traffic congestion, the pollution, the carbon emissions tied to that, as well as social dislocation, and just on and on and on. The ripple effects of not being able to adequately and affordably house our middle income is pretty obvious. And generally, our firm Catalyst decided to attack this issue after sort of viewing this from afar and determining that we're just not going to have fully functioning communities on a long-term basis if we can't house our middle income. So that's what our business focuses on. As Jennifer mentioned, we were lucky enough recently to successfully close an acquisition in the city of Hayward. One thing that Ben missed in his introduction, which I'll say for him, because I think there's some level of public disclosure here required. Ben is an advisor to Catalyst, so we should put that out there so everybody knows we're lucky to call him an advisor. There's a couple of groups who he lends his brilliant affordable housing mind to. But Jennifer, maybe to kick things off with the panel discussion, I'd love to circle back to you. So as the assistant city manager for a city the size of Hayward, you mentioned the 200 acres of public land. You mentioned sort of RHNA requirements. I think we're hearing from cities across the Bay Area and throughout California, that they're sort of nervous about the forthcoming RHNA numbers and how they're going to meet those. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of your specific focus and maybe the city's housing goals and needs and where you think the city's doing well, maybe where there's some shortfalls and how all of that sort of ties back to RHNA?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And just to give some context, I'm the assistant city manager, but I oversee our public land portfolio and then our housing division, which honestly 5 years ago was a very small division managing some rent control policies. And now it is really become so much more because of this real focus on addressing the housing crisis, including all kinds of policies related to preservation and protection, but also production. And so we have, really tried to create this incentives to housing production plan where include middle income, but it's really, as I mentioned earlier, we are at about 85 to 90% deficient on our current RHNA numbers related to moderate income housing. And we're trying to take a lot of proactive policies with ADUs, which count towards that moderate income level. And the state has obviously helped a lot with that. But it is really just because there are public subsidies and programs out there to address that cohort, it is really difficult for us to meet that income level. And so we were really glad to hear from Catalyst about some pilot programs. And that's really how we think of it, is that we really need to be aggressive about being innovative and trying some new programs, pilot these programs, learn from them, and see what we can try to do. And we were very attracted to it because a lot of the very low income programs obviously require public subsidy, local subsidy, which we have a local trust fund and all of that, but this came through just essentially a property tax exemption. So really great to find programs that don't require direct subsidy. And so we're really excited about that. But I think we have a really strong focus. Our public land portfolio is probably about, with the development we have planned on it now, over 25% affordable, trying to get to that 30%. So really trying to be proactive there as well. So I think we're putting all our policies in place. I think another challenge for us is just the market feasibility of the apartment market right now. There are places obviously in Silicon Valley where the rents justify the costs of multifamily housing, but we have set in place for the latest RHNA numbers. We have 2 BART stations. We've got form-based codes that promote pretty high density, but the market in Hayward does not support that level of density because of the costs of construction. So we're really challenged, even though we have all of our policies in place to meet the RHNA numbers, because of some of the market issues at play, really we believe on the construction cost side. And that's a real challenge for us. I think our policymakers, our politicians are very proactive and they're trying to put all those policies in place, but those are some of the issues we're having. Our latest RHNA numbers are kind of over 4,000 units. We're a city of about 160,000 people, and they're all exactly where we want them to be, where we have our form-based codes around our BART stations. And so we're very supportive of the latest RHNA numbers and really haven't taken any issue with those, and ready to kind of get to work if we can get the market to work right in our city.
Right.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that. I mean, I think what, I think Jennifer and Hayward are doing sort of all the right things to try and solve a problem. I think it's just worth noting that this is, in some ways, this is a new problem. If you look back 20 or 30, 40 years ago at the numbers in terms of what affordability was like and how far up the average area median income you needed to be to afford, median rents, this really wasn't an issue, a defining issue in places like Hayward. Typically, those folks who are in that middle income could find units to rent and afford. Frankly, in some cases, they could also find homes to buy. And so what we've seen is a whole combination of issues that have accumulated to make that almost an impossibility for folks below that median income. And the reasons for that are manifold and probably don't all need to be listed out for the purpose of folks on this particular Zoom. But whether it's impact fees or higher building code standards or constraints around zoning and permitting, the net effect has been it's much harder to find sites that pencil that you can work to sort of build completely unsubsidized housing that results in a good enough return that we can see market rate housing coming in the amounts and quantities that we need to keep pace with demand. And so this sort of new units getting permitted pretty much everywhere in California is down substantially on a per capita basis from where it was historically. It's actually also down from many other comparable metropolitan areas. And so, there's sort of like two ways, at least, there's many ways to fix that. One bucket of solutions is to try and unwind some of those things that have made it so hard to build, which is what Jennifer is describing that Hayward has done. Some of that is completely outside of the control of cities, though, too. I mean, issues like the cost of lumber, or the shortage of labor, or newer and better seismic and fire safety issues are things that are very hard for any one city to unwind. But the other way is to try and figure out ways to create some preferential benefits to people who are willing to go in and are willing to voluntarily commit to restrict their units to serve maybe a population that's slightly above the conventional tax credit population, but below where the market rate would end up being. And that can be sort of a corrective that, at least on the margins, will help to either more product delivered or convert and stabilize more product that's already been brought in as market rate.
Great points for sure. I mean, that's definitely been our thought. To date, our model has really been an acquisition model. So to touch on the asset that Jennifer mentioned in Hayward, this was a 70s built 300 plus unit multifamily asset, 100% market rate, where arguably, people there, given the sort of value add nature of most capital who's attracted to assets like that, the people there were arguably at risk of some pretty significant displacement. I think what we're pretty proud about today is the ability to acquire an asset like that, put $20 million in this case into renovations, make it a lot nicer, safer, better place to live, preserve the existing affordability that's there today, and add additional affordability. On top of that, this isn't the acquisition or preservation protection strategy is not the end all be all. I think we realize that. I think there's a moment in time, as Ben said, the situation hasn't always existed. And so we're finding these opportunities today to acquire assets like this and take something that is market rate housing and make it more affordable. But then ultimately, I think the answer, I'm sure you would agree, I'm sure Jennifer would agree, we really have a supply and demand issue here. It kind of comes back to Econ 101. And I think we have to find ways to build our way out of this issue over time. And so, I think, Ben, you said there's this strategy and that. It's probably both, right? It's all of the above, unwinding some of those development related issues that have made it really hard and really expensive to build. And so that's definitely sort of next in line for our company. We plan to continue our acquisition model, but we definitely want to start building with this model as well. And Ben, I'm curious, we talked about RHNA quite a bit. You've been pretty actively involved with us and with some others on some current legislation that's out there that would hopefully help sort of combine our model, others like it, to help people like Jennifer and the city of Hayward make a dent in those RHNA numbers. Can you touch a little bit on sort of what that legislation looks like and, where we are in the process? And, Jennifer, would love to hear from you after that about, whether you think that's helpful and whether this could help you, sort of get further into compliance with the RHNA numbers that you've been given.
Yeah, Jordan, you're talking about Assembly Bill 787, Gabriel.
Yeah.
So just to take a small step back, what is RHNA doing? That we have now entering into the sixth cycle of the RHNA process. So cities up and down the state of California are now about to put together their updated zoning, land use plans that will cover the next 8 years of growth that they expect to have in their communities. and they are responding to targets that have been assigned to them by their councils of government and from the council of government from the state, in terms of how many units they need to expect to get to plan for in order to accommodate the growth that each city will expect to have just from new household formation and in-migration and so on and so forth. The way that works in practice is there's actually 4 buckets of REMA, and every city has to have a plan for each of those 4 buckets. The buckets are broken down by income. So you have very low, low, moderate, above moderate, and you have a number assigned to each. And you literally have to be able to evidence back to the public and to the state that you have zoned enough land in a reasonable way so that you can credibly say that many units will be built in each of those categories. Now, on the lowest income, it really often that, yes, you have to find sites, but also that hinges on supply. And of course, on the above moderate side, yes, there are sites you don't need subsidy, but you're really trying to attract the market. The moderate income bucket has been one of the hardest for cities in California to hit. And in fact, if you look at the 5th cycle, you'll see across the board, very few California cities are keeping pace with or have accomplished their mod income category. Many have done above mod. Actually, quite a few have been successful in low and very low, but the mod is this real trough. And as we go into the 6th cycle, the state has really substantially increased their targets for the next round across all of those categories. So cities now up and down the state are sort of facing an incredible challenge of being able to evidence enough zone capacity in each of those 4 buckets. Doing that on the mod income, Jennifer mentioned one strategy, which I think has been very helpful, is accessory dwelling units. Those are naturally small, affordable units, and in many cases, that stock may actually exist illegally inside cities, and cities can work to formalize those units or get new ADUs put in as a way of getting moderate income credit. But there is no mechanism to reward under state law today the conversion of existing market rate properties into moderate income housing. In fact, there's actually there's a very small way to do that for low income if it's been intentionally placed within a city's housing program and limited to a certain number of units. And so AB 787 is basically saying, well, look, if a city can actually affirmatively convert market rate housing into something else like low or mod, and those are deed restricted units that are serving those populations, one would think there ought to be a way to get some credit for having done that. Today, there is no credit. So this would create a way that cities can actually, when they go to report their number of units permitted in any given year, they would actually be able to take some credit for those mod income. And the way that 787 works, it's just an offset. So if you take credit for converting a market rate building to moderate, you get those units in the one category, you lose them on the other. And then, excuse me, let me pause that thought for a second.
Oh. Someone has to unmute him, Allison.
So sorry, guys, the perils of having dogs in a Zoom world. So that's one key provision of it. And then the other part of AB 787 would say, when cities, from the period of time when cities get their first assignment of how many units they need to plan for, until the moment that they actually complete and get an approved housing element, if during that initial early window of time, the cities are successful in converting some of these properties, they can actually use that to offset their baseline of how much total zone capacity they need to get. In other words, they have actual mod income properties that are newly created that can then go into recalculating the baseline of their targets as they do that forward planning.
I think that's helpful. That's helpful. Yeah, Jennifer, would love for you to touch on that, and if anything we're doing you think is going to ultimately be helpful to the city in better meeting those numbers.
Yeah, and I was just looking at some of the chat. I wonder if you wanted to first talk a little bit about the Catalyst model, or if you wanted to get to that later. But it sounds like, I mean, I think we absolutely agree with trying to get credit for the conversion of these units and helping to meet that moderate income. But I wonder, it looks like some of the chat, do you want to talk a little bit about the model? And I'm happy to jump in more.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And we'll try to monitor these as we go here. I'm realizing maybe I didn't dive into the details enough of exactly what it is that we're doing. Partially, I wanted to avoid making this a commercial for Catalyst, but secondarily, my brain's a little foggy today, and I can't remember what I talked about or didn't talk about, to be honest. So So just to run through, sort of exactly what it is that we're talking about and what we're doing in the middle income space. The model that we have developed over the past number of years, which we call essential housing, is a model that hinges on governmental ownership. And so when we were really starting out at Catalyst at the beginning of 2015, and we were doing what many other people do in the capital A affordable housing world, leveraging tax credits and private activity bonds and other local subsidies and soft monies and grants and loans and everything else it takes to build a LIHTC development, we realized that that wasn't overwhelmingly scalable given the scale of the housing crisis in California and beyond. And as I mentioned earlier, we were increasingly paying attention to this growing middle income housing crisis where our essential workforce couldn't afford to live anywhere near where they work. They didn't qualify for those capital A affordable housing, LIHTC transactions, but the market rate product was just increasingly out of hand. So we spent 2 years with a working group that we assembled consisting of government officials and bankers, consultants, attorneys, trying to crack this code. And the culmination of those efforts was ultimately having a hand in launching the first ever governmental entity in the state of California, focused exclusively on middle income housing. And that entity is called CalCHA, the California Community Housing Agency. More specifically, it's a joint powers authority. It's a political subdivision of the state of California. And it was the first ever governmental entity formed in the state focused exclusively on middle income housing. There's other JPAs out there that do all sorts of things inside and outside of the housing space. Traditionally in the housing space, joint powers authorities are used as conduit issuers for more traditional capital A affordable housing developments. But the model that we helped to put together here and have since been rolling out across the state is a model that hinges on governmental ownership. That's really the secret sauce, if there is any. And because of CalCHA's direct ownership of assets like Creekwood in the city of Hayward, the asset we've been talking about here, those properties qualify for a 100% property tax exemption. And they can also be financed entirely by selling CalCHA issued tax exempt municipal bonds. The bond issuance takes place outside of the traditional CDLAC, California Debt Limit Allocation Committee process. So, there's no limit as to how many bonds can be issued and sold, which makes this really scalable. The city itself does not have to be the issuer or the owner of the asset. They're not credit enhancing or backstopping the bonds or taking on any liability of any kind. So it's very clean for the city. And the property tax exemption, to put that in context, most multifamily assets across California, if you look at the operating statement, property taxes generally make up about half of your overall expense load. And if you're able to shave half of those expenses away, reinvest those savings into making rents more affordable for middle income households, and at the same time, have a very scalable model that doesn't rely upon equity investors because you're 100% debt financed at a low cost of capital, that's really what drives this model. So in conjunction with CalCHA, we will have soon done a couple $2 billion of this over the past couple of years. There was a question about other cities outside of Hayward. There's about 30 members of CalCHA now. We've been unanimously approved in every one of those 30 jurisdictions across the state. There's more and more that we're talking to every day. And so it's definitely a model that maybe was more theoretical, probably when I first met Jennifer a couple of years ago. And, maybe she was a bit of a guinea pig at the time, and we were talking about all the great things we were going to do. We're pretty excited now that we can talk about a lot of the great things that we have done and that we hope to do in the future. There was another question about development. I touched on this earlier, but we do believe that the next iteration of this is going to be a development piece where we'll be able to take a very similar structure to what we've put together today and actually build net new units. And, Jennifer, I'm sure that from a city's perspective, potentially that's even more exciting. Not only are you not taking an existing asset off the tax rolls, right? It's sort of something's never even hitting the rolls, right? It's exempt from day one. But from a RENA perspective, things are a lot cleaner as well.
And maybe I could talk a little bit, just building off what you were just saying, Jordan, about why a city would do this and what the benefits, to us are. I mean, there's really when you're talking about a conversion, it creates stability, right? When we talk about a new development, you're talking about increased housing production, but we get stability. In Hayward, we've had a lot of projects that we have rent control, but from 1979. So most of our units, at least half of our units are not rent controlled, to have zero protection, from a local standpoint. And so by having this, there's essentially a regulatory agreement that gets placed on the property. So we're sure that there's stability for those units, and there are some built-in price caps, or annual appreciation caps. So you get some of that benefit and stabilization of those units, that are, and also kind of some anti-displacement policies that get wrapped in here too, so that you're not seeing people getting displaced as conversions happen, which we've even seen happen with low-income housing tax credit projects that are meeting the low and very low, where we see people displaced. So I think and then you're not having to provide local subsidy through our local trust fund or land dedication, where it's really just that property tax hit, which isn't great, but it's compared to what the benefit of the stabilization and those deed restricted units for. That was the reason we really wanted to get involved in this model. I mean, there are things we can talk about that are now coming up, that it's evolving, that we have questions about, but but I think it's a really great model that we want to see. We're committed to trying to make work in the city and expand into other projects.
Right.
Can I just elaborate also, Jordan, you described the Catalyst model very succinctly. I think it's worth just mentioning to the audience, there's also a couple of other organizations that are, there are many organizations actually out there that are doing similar work in terms of using the property tax exemption and the tax exempt bond issuances. And there are at least 2 other statewide joint powers authorities that are out there offering a somewhat similar kind of product. And this idea of using a property tax exemption is not in and of itself new. It's actually been, the subject has been a number of legislative proposals over the last couple of years, notably one authored by Phil Ting in the Assembly, to try and expand the existing welfare property tax exemption to make it work better in this space. And in fact, if you look at the state of California's current efforts to dispose of excess land, which was a big priority of Governor Newsom, one of the tricks they're doing there is actually to retain a fee on these dispositions. And so they're selling 99-year ground lease. That means that on those ground leases, they can actually have a mix of some market rate and some affordable, but the tax exemption should flow to all of those units. So I think we're beginning to see the power of this tool as a way to achieve that very important policy benefit. And guys, I mean, the budget, California budget's really awesome, and there are potentially billions of new dollars in play for things like Home Key and our core affordable housing programs. Fantastic. Like, those are desperately needed interventions. But if you look at the numbers in California right now, we're not even treading water. I mean, in terms of the number of new conventionally subsidized units that we're getting built every year, it's far fewer than the number of new households that are entering into that space where they desperately need that kind of housing. Or to say it another way, there's as many new subsidized units as are getting built in California. We're seeing that many units that used to be in the market rate and used to rent at those kinds of prices that are now migrating up and out of affordability because of the demand side measures.
All good points. Jennifer mentioned sort of seeing more proposals similar to this, maybe some discussions that have been happening internally, externally around, how good is the model? Is it good enough? Could it be better? Ben, you touch on other people that have come into the space that are doing this. I don't want to lose track of any of that. So let's make sure that we get to that in just a moment. I did want to kind of address some of these questions as they come in real time. There's clearly some folks who are in the weeds here, which are great. I saw a question about someone who's been reading our offering documents or something. And so that question about sort of the ultimate control or ownership or disposition of these assets is, I think, something that maybe we have failed to explain. I want to make sure that from a public benefit standpoint, people understand the upside and the trade-off that exists in this model in exchange for the loss of property tax revenues. The first is pretty obvious. I mean, if we take a market rate asset and convert it to rent restricted housing for middle income households, really overnight, you flip the switch on the creation of desperately needed below market housing rate units for people who otherwise may not be able to live in that community, that in many cases often power and serve that community in pretty impactful and essential ways. Secondarily, the piece I want to make sure that everybody on the call understands is that going back to this concept of these being 100% debt financed assets, these bonds are paid off by the project revenues over a 30, 35-year period of time. As those bonds are being paid off, all of the equity that's building up in the asset, as well as the long-term control of the asset, control of the affordability, the long-term cash flow, everything accrues to the underlying jurisdiction. So just to come back to Creekwood, the asset in the city of Hayward that we were fortunate enough to acquire in the past few months, that was, call it a $130-ish million asset in today's dollars. It's not unheard of in 30 years to think that that asset might be worth a multiple of that, right? Let's call it $400 million with no debt against it, producing tens of millions of dollars of cash flow annually. This gifting of the upside to the municipality is done in a very flexible way so as not to force a municipality to take title to an asset, because I think we know that there's many. And Jennifer, maybe this is an interesting thing for you to talk about, sort of the city's view of this. A, how valuable are those future economics? And B, what do you think the city's plan would be? Because, we've seen people disbanding housing authority assets, for example, as opposed to looking to acquire more. Maybe, public ownership of assets has not always gone well for everybody, and cities aren't staffed to be asset managers, for example.
Mhm.
But hopefully the thing that resonates with the underlying jurisdiction is that this value creation will exist in one way or another, whether the city takes title or not, or asks us to sell the asset and give them all of the embedded equity, that all of that's going to end up with the city. But would love to hear from a city's perspective, the view on the future economics versus what's accomplished today, because I definitely hear from people, hey, that's great, but I'm not going to be working here in 30 years. So,
Right. Well, I will say this was probably the hardest thing for us to wrap our brains around, was this idea that there would be some giant windfall at the end of the debt repayment. And it just seemed, honestly, it was almost too, it was the too good to be true. Like, is this really true? We looked at the documents and legal documents, talked to our outside counsel, we really kind of studied this because it did just seem too good to be true. And I think we did, I think it's a really interesting added benefit, but I will say, as we all know in politics, right, and it's hard for a council that's elected on a 4-year cycle to get excited about 20 years from now and getting a ton of money. I mean, that said, it certainly is an added benefit, but I think it's really, when you think of all the problems we have now, and all the issues we're facing, I think I can't say that was the driving force behind it, but I think something that, and also still this element of, are we really going to see that money? And I think legally we see that we could. I mean, I think we have some questions about what kind of additional debt could be taken on by the project and whether or not we would end up, could that erode future value? And so we have some questions about that, but I think it is a great added benefit. And we did have some conversations with our policymakers about what that, could we turn that into wealth generation? We have a lot of conversations right now in Hayward about, systemic racism and housing and how we can build wealth, especially in our communities of color. And so I think this idea that money could be reinvested there to build more wealth, and we also had a lot of angst about being asset managers. And so we did have some preliminary conversations with nonprofit affordable housing developers that we could potentially assign the asset to and have some sort of financial arrangement with them. And so we were able to kind of process through this. And I think it is really an exciting long-term benefit. But I think from a city's perspective, and at least Hayward, I think it was hard for us to kind of monetize that or think about that as a huge benefit today. So I think those were some of the thoughts we had about that longer term value proposition.
It's helpful to understand. I think there's 3 different threads there that I'd love to go even further down those paths. Mm-hmm. And Ben, feel free to jump in on any one of these 3. The first that I heard is just sort of, what can we be doing better, right? So this concern about additional debt, for example, right? To make sure that sort of the day before, the city's option opens, there's not some recapitalization event that unwinds everything that the city thought they were stepping into or something, right? How are there sort of additional, a belt and suspenders approach to make sure that can't necessarily happen? The reinvestment or almost conversion of the asset, well, 2 different thoughts. So reinvestment of the ultimate economics that are generated by this into other housing related themes. You touched on one that's near and dear to our heart through nonprofits that we support and other work that we're attempting to do, but looking to kind of reverse some of the results of decades and decades of segregationist housing policies. It's a really interesting one where you can take, something that we did today that ultimately generates economics to and reinvest those into other needs that are sort of unrelated to this core focus of middle income housing. But then additionally, we talked about sort of the older value add type nature of Creekwood being a late 70s built asset where we're injecting a bunch of capital and preserving that affordability. But a lot of what we've done across the state is actually brand new, big, nice, Class A assets. And one thing that I've thought about, which really touches on, these concepts of how do you sort of give back to certain populations and also create more than affordable renter opportunities, but affordable ownership opportunities. Is there a model where 15 years in to a brand new asset, you still have an asset that's in pretty great shape, that asset is actually converted to a for sale structure, to a condo structure where the city then triggers its option and sells units at a far below market rate basis to a certain demographic of folks or people who are already living there or essential workers or, whatever it may be. And so we haven't gone down that path yet, but it's definitely something that we'd like to spend more time on.
Right. Or Jordan, I mean, there's also an opportunity. I think the other almost more obvious way to do it in my mind is, hey, you can reposition this asset to begin to house, let's say, formerly homeless individuals as units trade out. You can repopulate them with folks who are maybe paying a much lower income amount. And so when or you can slowly over time begin to ratchet down some affordability levels so you actually are getting down to the 50% or 30% of AMI. Those are things that compress the economics, but actually are really helpful, for a property. And that opportunity may not exist at the front end at the moment that you're actually acquiring the asset, but you may be able to get more to that deeper affordability 10, 15 years out, particularly if you're not pushing, one of the great gifts I think of this model is you're not pushing rents up to market every year. You're keeping them relatively stable. So you're sort of over time getting properties that will tend to be more naturally affordable, and you can build out more of a striation of incomes within that property, deeper into the project.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was talking to Jennifer earlier about, especially in COVID times where, due to obvious reasons, rents have cratered quite a bit compared to where they were a couple of years ago. And if you look at that combined with HUD income figures that are continually, at least in recent years, increasing at oftentimes double-digit clips, you can find yourself in a space where at certain income bands, perhaps, mathematically, there's not a big discount to market, for example, at the 120% AMI level, for example. But if you believe that there will be a pretty quick snapback, we're actually already seeing it across the state at various assets where leasing trends are way up, occupancy's up, rates are up. Ben, to your point about having increasing affordability year after year for people who are sort of locked in at today's rent levels, and we see this continued dislocation of what happens with rents compared to what happens with incomes, which is, that's been a pretty obvious relationship over time. There's just going to be more and more affordability that's built up year over year. So Jennifer, we got a little bit sort of sidelined, but you were starting to go down the path of what we can do better, right? So we've heard that the city had some concerns, kind of worked through them. We've been able to do one of these successfully now. We'll continue to report to the city around how we're doing from an affordability standpoint. But when you think about the model itself, how it fits into kind of the entire housing spectrum from homelessness to home ownership, other policies that the city has, any thoughts on how the model could be even more powerful at a local level?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things you're touching on, I think were, because we have one project, there are, as you mentioned there, and I think maybe Ben mentioned, there's more competition. So we're seeing this pop up in a number of different projects. So I think then we've identified the same issue, talking about the market rent issue. And so I think our biggest concern is, you're taking these projects off the property tax rolls, which I think Hayward is prepared to do, but in exchange for affordability. And if you're having market rents that aren't that different from the restricted rents, that doesn't serve the public purpose. We're not, Hayward's not interested in doing projects like that. That's not what we want. And so I think we're going to be looking carefully at these projects to make sure that they are in fact getting priced below market. How you do that in a way, how do you determine what market is, and trying to figure out with this model how to do that. I think we're definitely prepared to roll up our sleeves and try to figure it out. But I think that's our biggest concern. And I do think in some ways an opportunity. I think for you, Jordan, it's a little harder, but I think the cities have a little more leverage here, where there's this competition potentially for buyers that want to use this model for certain types of projects. They're competing, the property owner wants the best price, the city wants the most affordability. And so we do have cities, those of you who are on this that are related to cities, you have some leverage here. You don't have to enter into these agreements, and if they're not providing affordable rents, then you don't have to do it, right? So I think really using that leverage to make sure that these projects aren't getting priced up and the market rents, you're not getting the restricted rents that really provide affordability for your community. And so it's I think that's where we're really going to be studying this model further, and that's where our concerns are right now. I think we don't think it's not insurmountable. We need to kind of roll up our sleeves and figure it out. But I think it's a powerful model. I think it's something where it's a lot easier to ask politicians to forgo a little tax revenue than it is to allocate millions of dollars of general fund money, right? So I think it's a great way to get cities to buy into, providing subsidy for affordable housing in a way that doesn't hit their bottom line quite in the same way. So,
Jennifer, you just touched on, but I want to pull this up because I think it's an important point. There has been criticism of this model that really it's giving cities sort of too much say in the question of property tax exemption, because of course, when you look at who benefits from the payment of property taxes, it's not just the city. The counties are major beneficiaries, the schools, the state. And so I think it does beg a question of, well, a deal might look good from a city's perspective, but it really needs to be, we really need to make sure that these deals are objectively good to an outside observer looking in, who may be looking at foregone revenues from the schools and so on and so forth. And so I think it is incumbent on all of us, I think, to make sure that when we're seeing these transactions happening, that there is, an actual documentable discount to what a market rate rent would be, or there's some number of units within those transactions that are locked in, at or below 80%. Or, I think it probably is important for us to collectively have some idea of some guardrails that we are recommending for cities and others that are looking at this as they go into these conversations. If nothing else, to insulate them from that political risk of incurring the ire of these other taxable entities.
Yeah, clearly, Ben, it's something that we talk about all the time. We clearly feel some responsibility, having been at the forefront of this a couple of years ago and introducing a whole host of people to this model. And things were definitely different when we were the only people doing this. We had a couple year head start. Things were a lot more methodical and measured. And obviously, there's others that have come into the space. People are sort of aware of how this works. We've definitely seen the bidding up of assets. We've seen less affordability being created. Jennifer, it's interesting. I would say, I'm kind of surprised city to city at how some people really dig into the details and are really focused and really care, and other cities seemingly don't. And you watch some of those city council meetings, and I think a lot just gets lost sort of in translation. And generally, when people hear that there's housing that's going to be affordable to middle income households, maybe they haven't done the math in that city, and maybe they don't realize that today, back to this concept we're talking about of rents maybe naturally being affordable to 120% AMI households, they're not really gaining anything, right? They're sort of giving something up and not really gaining anything. So this is something that we talk about with Ben, with other advisors of ours internally all the time. We want to make sure that we're really at the forefront of this. Again, we feel some responsibility sort of for helping to innovate this entire structure. And we really want to lay out sort of a list of things that, any city should be getting if they're interested in venturing down this path. I don't know if we want to spend some time sort of getting into the weeds on any of those things, Jennifer, if you have any other ideas. I mean, we talked about the additional debt provisions. We talked about some sort of baseline discount, right? Some very provable, obvious discount to rents. I don't know if you have a figure in mind that you think sort of makes sense, but anything else that's on your mind? I mean, I would love to just throw it out there and talk through some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discount, you know, we've been talking internally a little bit about a 10% discount. But then you still have to establish the baseline market, like what is the market rent, and figuring out what that is, you know, which isn't, there's ways you could do that. So it's not, I think we talk a lot about cost burden. So maybe there's a way to tie it to cost burden. I also think there could be a way to, you know, compete for a deeper affordability, right? So to get even, you know, maybe a certain number of units, as Ben mentioned, have to be at a low or very low income or something, you know, so maybe there's a way to really build in deeper affordability for a certain percentage of the units so that we're at least knowing we're getting some units that are well below market, we're not going to have that issue with. So those are some ideas we're talking about. But really encourage, and I like Ben's idea a lot of like creating some framework. I mean, it's always hard when it's through legislation because then it's one size fits all, but I do think that some way that we could create some parameters so that you're making sure that if we're giving up tax revenue, if all the entities are giving up tax revenue, that we're getting an actual public benefit that meets the state's purpose of, you know, building housing and, you know, making housing more affordable. I think that's a great idea too. I don't know, Ben, if you have other ideas.
I mean, one other obvious opportunity, I think, for a lot of cities also have housing authorities that are in the business of overseeing voucher programs. Here in the Bay Area, actually, voucher utilization rates are at historically low levels, which is to say, voucher holders wait years to get a voucher assigned to them, and then they spend 6 months trying and failing to redeem those vouchers in the marketplace. It's very hard to find units that, you know, even though in California today on the books, it's illegal not to rent to a voucher holder. Right. You know, the rent may be above what HUD is willing to compensate for. There may be security deposit issues. There may be issues getting out to these. I think there's an obvious opportunity also to take advantage of these converted assets to say, hey, can we, you know, collaborate with our housing authority and the JPA to try and figure out, or with Catalyst, try and figure out how we can actually sort of affirmatively market maybe it's some number of vacant units in that building to these, you know, these voucher holding families. I think it's particularly elegant too for some of these assets that are located in neighborhoods with good schools and high performing schools and low crime rates and, you know, the other amenities that we know voucher holders need for their kids to be successful. So I think those are the kinds of really creative plays as we get deeper into this model. I think we begin to see opportunities where we can actually, you know, again, we're not borrowing from scarce resources, but we're helping the resources that are out there to more effectively deploy. And by the way, guys, I mean, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric today in Washington, D.C. about substantially expanding the number of vouchers that the president has pledged to get universal vouchers out there. There's just no way that works in a place like the Bay Area or in coastal California communities, given how locked up the supply is for redeeming those vouchers.
Ben, can you, as long as we're having sort of an open, honest discussion here, while it's true that the voucher utilization rate is embarrassingly low, can you talk about some other reasons? There's some obvious reasons, you know, why that is, but there are other reasons where even people who would love to be in a position to take vouchers, who operate multifamily assets, got kind of worn out on dealing with HUD and policies, and, you know, they have units that sit vacant for 3 months while they wait for someone to come out and tick a box that it's inhabitable, even though it's a beautiful, newly renovated unit, and, you know, rent's not paid on time. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of complaints that you would get from people who have taken or do take vouchers today. And I know that there's legislation being thrown around right now in real time in DC about how to make this easier and how to incentivize more people, especially in the, I believe there's a bonus program. I'm sure you're up to speed on this, on sort of encouraging people to take vouchers in high income areas. But as long as we're, you know, being real about why this situation exists, can you touch on how to make this work on both sides of the equation?
Yeah, there's a great bipartisan bill in the Senate right now moving forward that would do several of the things you mentioned, Jordan, to really make it much easier for owners to participate. Things like providing incentive payments for owners who sign up, and trying to sort of streamline the inspections. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why property owners really opt out of this and or choose not to play in this space. I do think, though, California and this particular application is particularly useful. Number one, California does have a statewide non-discrimination law that means all property owners should be engaging in this space. But number two, I think brass tacks, like you have the opportunity at the city as you're negotiating this deal to create a kind of formal partnership with the local housing authority where you actually could do this sort of at scale and en masse. And so part of the challenges that individual mom and pop landowners incur is because they don't have a relationship with the housing authority. They don't know how that process works, and they're sort of on the receiving end. But I think a formalized partnership where you said, look, we're going to affirmatively market 10% of our units, vacant units, to voucher holders with the support of the housing authority to then actually help sort of expedite some of that paperwork and sort of do the inspections all en masse, I think would solve for a lot of these issues. And I think could work nicely in jurisdictions that were interested in going down that path.
Jennifer, how big of an issue is this in Hayward around people just, maybe they, as Ben said, they waited forever to get a voucher and now that they can't find anybody to take it?
Yeah, it is a big issue, and you know, we've tried to do some things locally, but you know, I think I like the idea of having it be an incentive. I mean, I think it's really hard to enforce some of the fair housing, you know, the discrimination stuff. So you know, it's against the law, but people still do it, and it's kind of easy to do if you have. So I think creating an incentive for the use of vouchers, I think, is a great way to, you know, see if we can move them along. You know, it's something we've talked about, and this is outside the middle income, but looking at hotels and whether or not we could kind of create a direct relate, like if there are a big influx of vouchers, could we create a waiting list or some way and then work with a local hotel or, you know, through home key or something and kind of team up with these programs that you'd have actual subsidies? Because our problem with the hotel acquisition is the ongoing operating subsidies and how we pay for that. And so maybe having a relationship with the voucher holders and the hotel acquisition. Anyway, so these are, I think it's something, if we do get an expansion and a lot more of them, trying to be more creative about how we can use them is going to be important.
I think that's helpful. Maybe, you know, I know we've been addressing these questions as they've come through. If anybody else has any last minute questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat room here. You know, maybe one last question on this end, Jennifer, I'm curious, you know, as you look at the landscape of people who may now be calling about different opportunities, and as Ben mentioned earlier, there's at least three, you know, there's 3 different JPAs now who are doing similar things in the space, and they may be working with a handful each of different folks like Catalyst, although we don't think there's anybody like Catalyst, but I'll say like Catalyst. How does the city sort of, you know, wrap their head around, you know, do I join all 3? Do I join one? Do I join with the thought being that, you know, we really want to encourage them to partner with this group versus that group because we know them and you know, they're mission-based or they're offering us sort of a better goodie bag, right, from an affordability standpoint as others. And then maybe as part of that, like how many, you've said before, I think you view this kind of as a pilot program, right? So how many assets, where would we sort of entertain this, and how long would have to pass before we felt like, yeah, this is really working, we're getting the affordability we wanted? That's a lot of questions, but any of those I think would be great to hear from.
Yeah, I mean, our council, because it was a pilot program, we put a cap at about 1,000 units, just because they're basically granting the authority to our city manager to enter into these transactions and didn't want to do that beyond 1,000 units, which doesn't mean we can't go in on a single basis and ask for them to approve a project. I do think we're concerned a little bit about how much competition there is and how many occur. I don't think it's a problem yet, but something we're kind of keeping, you know, we can't, you know, we need property tax. It's at least in Hayward, one of our biggest revenues and most stable revenues. So you have to be careful, you know, about that. But I guess what I've very recently, just in the last week, talked to my staff about is each of these projects need to be evaluated on their own. Like, do they make sense on their own? Are they providing affordability? Are they providing benefits? But also with that cap that the council's put in place, we also have to somewhat evaluate them against each other, because we have a limited kind of supply of how many we can do. And so that's kind of our approach. I don't know if that makes sense, but they have to make sense on their own, but it also is an opportunity for us if we have two projects that are in two different areas and competing. Is one of the projects, a problem complex that there's a lot of instability and a lot of issues like that could use some stability for the residents, or is one providing deeper affordability? And so I think we're looking at it both on a standalone and relative basis to be able to evaluate which projects we do. But I do think it can't be infinite, right? But I don't think it will be. So, I think we're going to be a little hesitant to join other authorities at this point, probably just because we've got 1,000 units with an existing authority. There are different, companies that are using the CalCHA model. So I think we're going to wait, get some data, really figure out if this is working, how well is it working before we'd probably join another authority. And then we'll see where we go from there.
Got it. Ben, we're quickly racing towards the 3 o'clock hour here. Any closing thoughts on your end?
Yeah, just like I think there is maybe call it like an opportunistic window of opportunity for this model right now. I mean, we are still seeing, although Jordan, you said rents are beginning to creep back up. We are seeing a really huge widening gulf right now in terms of what rents and rental properties are at compared to for sale. And I think trying to take advantage of that opportunity now and lock in this affordability wherever we can makes a lot of sense. I also think it's helpful for a lot of cities that some of the true budget crises that we feared a year ago seem largely not to be materializing. The fiscal situation is mostly stable. There is hopefully, there is federal funding as well coming to cities to help. And so I think that allows us to have a little bit more of a sort of just at least a balanced conversation about weighing these pros and cons. But at the end of the day, this is a powerful tool serving a niche to the market that we just haven't had as a tool in our toolkit in the past. And it is very scalable. So I think it really demands much more attention than those in the affordable housing industry have been giving it. It demands a lot more attention than those who are sort of in the housing policy space have been giving it. And I think, with this innovation and entrepreneurship also comes some challenges, but these seem like things that, at least we generally know what the solutions are. We need to just figure out how to sort of make sure that they are, in fact, the best practices are the ones that are getting onboarded on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And we want to make sure that it remains a powerful tool. So we want to be all ears when our city partners, give us feedback on what's working, what's not, what could work even better. So, we're 2 minutes out. I know that we all book our Zoom lives here hour to hour. So, people would probably be appreciative of getting a minute back so they could, have a sip of water or something. But really want to thank Jennifer and the city of Hayward. Want to thank Ben, the Turner Center. Want to thank SB at Home for collaborating with us on this panel. Thanks to everybody who joined in and asked questions. I'm sure, you can find any of us if you have follow-up questions. We'd love to take any of them, but thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.